Thanks very much, Suresh, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. As Suresh said, I'm going to give a brief overview of our model of policy change, which we call the Kaleidoscope Model. And then, because the model is a little abstract, I think it helps to have a concrete application. So I'm going to talk about the application to input subsidy programs, and then Cheryl Hendricks will talk more specifically about our work on micronutrient interventions. So in terms of the broad motivations for this work, we know, as Suresh alluded to, at least for the last decade, there has been a big push for kind of results-based agenda and a real focus on development targets, objectives, goals. And a lot of us as researchers and practitioners are often judged by our progress towards meeting those indicators. And there has been obviously a large emphasis on achieving policy impact. And we took a step back and said, in order to actually achieve policy impact, you need to have a broader understanding and a holistic understanding of the underlying policy process. And so our Kaleidoscope model is inductively derived. It began with a huge literature review, political economy, public administration, policy process literatures, and then informed by looking at actual case studies on the ground of what drove policy reform across a wide array of areas. We're talking education, health, nutrition, agriculture, social protection, and narrowing down what were the consistent set of variables that seemed to be consistently important, regardless of the country, regardless of the policy domain. And so we came up with 16 variables that seemed to always be really important. And we can kind of call them the proximate variables. They're highlighted in the inner white circle of the diagram here. And don't worry, I'm going to break each slice of this model up so that people can actually see it. But this just gives you the overview. And what we have on the outside are these 5 main elements of the policy process, from agenda setting to evaluation and reform. And then the inner gray part is really just a non-exhaustive list of important contextual conditions that often influence those 16 proximate variables in the center. We call it the Kaleidoscope model, not just because of the visual here, but also just like when you have a kaleidoscope, when you kind of shift the kaleidoscope, the light refracts a new pattern. It's similar here. When you shift looking at a different element of the policy process, all the variables are still important in some sense, but there's an emphasis on a certain subset of variables that seem particularly important for that element of the policy process. So after we inductively derived this model, we then wanted to test it. And we wanted to test it first in 2 main policy domains that we thought were quite different, because we thought we'd have greater confidence in the model if it was applicable across two very different areas. So we're looking at input subsidies, seed fertilizer subsidies, and then micronutrient interventions. I've noted here some of the differences across the 2 domains. They're particularly different in terms of the political economy constituencies and issues they bring up, in terms of the concentration or dispersion of the beneficiaries, in terms of the engagement of international donors and domestic governments. And then we have a suite of tools that we use to do this work on the policy process. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these, but we do have a kind of practitioner's guidebook that'll be coming out by the end of the year that goes through each of these tools. So I'm going to talk about the model more specifically by applying it to input subsidy programs, and the 3 case studies that we looked at in this domain were Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia. They were initially chosen because there's a lot of similarities across these 3 countries, but they all chose very different design modalities for their programs. And we really wanted to understand where that came about and understand some of the refinements to the policies over time. So Zambia has, I guess, the oldest of the 3 programs, starting in 2002 under the name of the Fertilizer Support Program. Tanzania started with a pilot in 2003. I think it's more recently well known for having this smart subsidy approach that began in 2008. And Ghana has had a little bit more of an ad hoc and haphazard approach to its subsidy program. Started with a voucher program in 2008, moved to a waybill system, and then has kind of been off and on in which years it actually implements the program. Okay, so in terms of first looking at what pushed these input subsidy programs on the agenda, the Kaleidoscope model talks about 3 key variables at the agenda setting stage. The first and foremost is that you have to have this kind of recognized relevant problem, that this is really, that the policy would be addressing an issue that's of key importance in a country. And this was very true across all three of these countries. There's a problem of low use of inorganic fertilizer, particularly for food staple crops, and that's directly linked to lack of affordability for many smallholders, particularly since market liberalization. Then you had, in combination with that, focusing events. Focusing events are critical junctures that really shift the status quo. These could be economic crisis, it could be an election, it could be a natural disaster. In our case, we saw, particularly for the Zambian FSP and the initial Tanzanian pilot, the Southern African droughts of the early 2000s were a main precipitator. And then the global food and fuel price crisis of 2007, 2008, we really saw a scaling up or the initiation of the program in the Ghanaian case. Now, you often have these two factors in a lot of countries. What really seemed to be the kind of third element here was powerful advocates. That's the third element of our agenda-setting slice of the Kaleidoscope Model. And here you had the presidents in these three countries, particularly in Zambia and Ghana. The presidents were big advocates, putting these on the agenda seemingly out of nowhere, seeing fertilizer subsidies as being an important answer to the various crises that they were facing. And then in Ghana and Tanzania, you also saw a big constituency of fertilizer companies seeing that subsidies would be helping to address increasing demand for fertilizer. So when we move on to thinking about the design, obviously you can have various designs for input subsidies. And here in our Kaleidoscope model, we talk about three variables again. The first is knowledge and research. It's the research that we engage in at IFPRI and Michigan State and many of the other institutes represented here. We found for the subsidy programs in the initial round, when these first came about, research didn't play a huge role. It was really in the subsequent refinements of these programs over time when you really saw research having a much stronger role. But regional diffusion, examples from other countries did play a big role. So Tanzania looking to Malawi for its subsidy program. Norms, biases, ideology, that's distinct from research in a way, right? It's sometimes not often founded on empirical fact. But we find that you can't discount the kind of norms or ideologies that both donors and governments have in terms of what policies and which designs are appropriate. And we did see big trade-offs in terms of the role of the state versus the market with these policies. In Ghana, a private sector approach was obvious there. They didn't think about a kind of government supply chain approach, which tended to be more favored in the Zambian case. And then cost-benefit calculations. Any policy design, there's going to be winners and losers. There's also a concern of economic costs and political costs. In the initial design of these programs, there were low initial economic costs. A lot of donors were willing to bear the initial costs of these programs, particularly because they came about at a crisis period. And there were low political costs or high political benefits for these programs. In all three countries, people talk a lot about these being a modality for rural vote buying. So when we go to thinking about adoption, once you have kind of a set of policies on the table, again, we have three variables here. The first is talking about opponents and proponents and their relative power. You always have stakeholders who are for or against a particular policy. We add this element of being powerful in terms of their degree of influence vis-a-vis the key decision makers, which are our eighth variable here, which is the government veto players. And so when we talk about opponents and proponents, when these policies first get off the ground, there's very few opponents because, of course, the policies haven't had time to manifest. They haven't been institutionalized for very long. But as we see kind of various turns of the Kaleidoscope model, as you see refinements of these programs over time, you see much more diffusion of opponents and proponents. But they have very different reasons for why they're either supporting the subsidy programs or against them. Government veto players, this is reflecting kind of a political science term which reflects the sufficient set of actors whose consent you need in order for a policy to go forward. And all three countries are strongly presidential systems. They have proactive presidencies. The legislatures are incredibly weak. And as I mentioned earlier, the presidents were very strong advocates of these programs. As far as in Ghana and Zambia, it was almost President Wanawasa of Zambia and Kufar of Ghana basically announced these programs as a fait accompli to their parliaments. And then our last variable here was propitious timing. So timing is always really important in terms of taking into account the budget calendar or the election calendar, the legislative calendar. And we did find that this was critical in these cases, but this is a variable that we had a lot more difficulty in getting traction on because sometimes the timing was important in very different ways. So the subsidies being announced before elections in Ghana, being announced after elections in Zambia to consolidate legitimacy. So this was one of the variables that I think operationalizing we found is one of the trickiest to do. Implementation here. So I think this is an area where we often see the disconnect between policy formulation, or policies are adopted, but they never are either implemented or they're not implemented in the way that was intended. A lot of subsidy programs, they have great intentions, what they're going to do, and then of course you wind up having maybe a lot of leakage, a lot of patronage that happens as a result of the programs. So here we have 4 variables. Requisite budget, this was just, I think, obvious in all these cases. Particularly the release of promised donor resources proved critical, whether that was ag budget support in Ghana, whether that was poverty reduction budget support in the Zambian case, whether it was World Bank support for the Tanzanian program. Institutional capacity, though, was where we really saw a lot of the problems. Seeing just the lack of coordination between finance and agricultural ministries, and so having delays in disbursements from finance to agriculture, which then leads to delays in disbursements to importers, fertilizer importers, and affects the implementation of the whole program. These are also often complex programs at the subnational level where you already have quite weak capacity. So working with kind of district or ward or village authorities or cooperatives that are already lacking in capacity. Implementation veto players, that's our 12th variable. This is distinct from the government veto players we talked about earlier. So these are the implementers, often the non-governmental implementers, whose engagement is really consequential for the program. So in this case, not surprisingly, fertilizer importers were really essential implementation veto players. Anytime they decided not to participate in the program, or they were paid late, so they delayed importing and distribution, this really affected how the program was implemented. And then finally, we have commitment of policy champions. Policy champions are a little distinct from our initial advocates. Champions are the ones who stay on board with the program way after it's gotten on the agenda and push through the adoption stage. And we saw this being much higher in Tanzania and Zambia than in Ghana. And then I'm just going to quickly go over the last 3 here on evaluation and reform. So I mentioned earlier that research didn't often play a role in the initial agenda setting stage, but it does play a consequential role here in what we call changing information and beliefs at the evaluation stage. So we saw a preponderance of research, media reports, parliamentary audits on these programs over time that really played a role in changing, refining these programs over time. What makes governments receptive to this research is often a change in material conditions, particularly a macroeconomic crisis, a change in the modality of donor funding, and finally an institutional shift, which is our 16th variable here, where we saw the arrival of either a new president, a new party, a new agricultural minister, who was often wanting to create a legacy and kind of rethink these programs. So whether it was kind of introducing an e-voucher, for example, in Zambia in 2015, or switching to a way-bill program in Ghana in 2010. Okay, and I just want to conclude here. We have some specific recommendations. You might have seen in the synthesis reports we've got on the table, specific recommendations on the ISPs in particular, one of which is that these programs are very complex. They have multiple objectives. It results in these complex program designs. And these may be inappropriate given the weak institutional capacity. We also know that these are intensely political programs, so often giving advice just based on technical considerations alone, so that these are inappropriate for soil fertility types, for example, that may not win the day without taking into account the political elements of these programs. And just to conclude on the broader kaleidoscope model, and I think Steve will talk about this a little bit more, but I think what we see as the advantage of this is not all 16 variables are always relevant, but what we find is that they provide a maximum set of conditions that you can be thinking about when you're thinking about how can we get policy reform. And they can work, we've obviously shown them retrospectively, but they can work prospectively in terms of thinking about, well, what might be the 4 considerations if we want to implement a program, or if we're thinking about getting traction on design modalities. Excuse me. So I'll conclude there. Turn over to Cheryl.
Thank you.